Sup? I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. You can buy most of that shit that I make over at post-mort.com. Hope to see you there.
The latest Andrew Tate flare-up really throws a lot of things into sharp relief. Tate sets himself up as some sort of guru of masculinity, and he's far from the only one. But, there's the Tates of this world with the whole grind set, fuck bitches, make money, that's what passes for a philosophy. There's also the Jordan Petersons of this world, which offer their own more sort of pseudo-intellectual guide and appeals to tradition. But underlying it all is a definite crisis of masculinity, which these sorts of people are emerging to offer simplistic and erroneous solutions to. Now, they are a reaction. They're a reaction to a great deal of pressure upon men from one side. Feminization of society and the workplace, demonization of men as being the root cause of all the ills of the world, blaming men for everything that is bad or wrong in the world, a new sort of lopsided sexism where it's anathema to have prejudices or stereotypes about women, but in which it is perfectly acceptable to have stereotypes and so on about men. And a lot of these stereotypes, a lot of this blame is a holdover from a past era. It reminds me, and this may seem like an odd analogy, but it reminds me about prejudices towards adult work, to which I am now adjacent. I've always had an interest in the sociology of being a free speech advocate, anti-censorship advocate. A lot of the critiques of the adult industry are based upon stereotypes from the 1980s. If you listen to someone like Gail Dines, the adult industry that they're describing no longer exists. Women are largely their own bosses in the industry now. For example, very few people are being controlled and enslaved by drugs or whatever else, but this is the image that she has of the industry, rooted in this outmoded and historical context. And similarly, men are being blamed for things that other men did long before they were born. It's a critique of quote-unquote patriarchy that isn't applicable in the modern world. So there are men today who've never done any of these horrible things or supported these horrible structures or anything else, still being blamed for it. So what does feminism, for want of a better word, what does all this social critique and blame flinging towards men, what does it offer men? Where's the empowerment? Where is the widening of options? Where is the examination and recontextualization of masculinity? It definitely doesn't come from that side. This patriarchy hurts men too is inherently self-contradictory. Why would a society that no longer seems to exist, set up by men for men to elevate men over everyone else, why would that hurt men so much? It simply doesn't make sense, and this biased form of analysis has nothing to offer men, no solutions to offer men. Just take your licks, keep your head down, take the blame, take the hatred, give up everything. Yeah, that's not an appealing. It's not an appealing philosophy. It's not a way to help men. It's not a way to change anybody's minds. And so Tate, etc., are a reaction to that, equally extreme and detrimental, but appealing in a sort of no fuck you sort of way. It's shallow, and there don't seem to be any more positive forms of masculinity. There doesn't seem to be any honest examination or redefinition going on. Everything out there seems to be either capitulation in the war of the sexes or radicalization. It's either emasculating or it's a genuine case of toxic masculinity, as in the case of Tate, etc. I'm hardly a model of masculinity for anyone, so I don't feel that I can offer anyone advice, but there needs to be someone out there with a more healthy, revised, empowering model of masculinity that they can relate to people, that doesn't fall into either of these traps. It's not me as a disabled creative intellectual. I don't have anything to offer, but I have some idea of what the process might look like. It might begin with broadened concepts of masculinity and redefinitions and recontextualization of different modes of masculinity. If rather than seeing the stay-at-home father who looks after the kids as being an emasculated pseudo-woman, we saw him as protective, a defender of the family, that sort of thing. That might be a way to examine and recontextualize that to make it an acceptable form of masculinity without capitulation, saying, yeah, okay, I am an emasculated pseudo-woman, but also without rejecting it and rejecting those responsibilities. Something like that. There needs to be a rehabilitation of men's image. We are not our ancestors. We didn't do any of these things, so it is unfair and unjust to hold men today responsible for the sins of the fathers, just as it would be to hold anyone responsible for someone else's actions before they were even born. This doesn't seem likely to happen, though, as the dominant paradigm is one of blaming men and holding men today to account for things that men of the past may have done. And plenty of men in the past were progressive and part of movements that changed things. Men's rights. Now, this is a controversial topic. I never really went all in on men's rights, but I had my flirtations with it. I have been disappointed in the way that it has become associated with the right wing, desperately seeking for some sort of oxygen of publicity. And unpopular as it might be, this is an important issue, just the same way that women's rights were. Men used to have more rights, indeed. I think that has reversed in Western countries. But it also came with a lot of responsibilities in the past. And now, men still retain all of the responsibilities and the weight on their shoulders that they used to have, but without a commensurate change on the other side. We've got less rights, the same responsibilities. There hasn't been a lessening in the responsibilities to go with a lessening of the rights, and the shoe is very much on the other foot. And to their credit, men have allowed this to happen, but to the point where it's now detrimental. An example of this might be how there are still bursaries and other funding and so on that women and other minorities can access to help them in higher education, while men who are statistically failing in higher education don't have access to the same kind of support. And if we're talking about equality and fairness, these kinds of issues need to be looked at. Another unquestionable example, well, should be unquestionable, is that of domestic abuse. Roughly 40% of domestic abuse is suffered by men, but there isn't even 10% of the capacity that exists for women victims of intimate partner violence and domestic abuse. Again, if we're talking about equality, if we're talking about fairness, we need to make it accessible. We need to have a proportionate amount of capacity, and we need to encourage men suffering in these situations to come forward without feeling like less of a man. So while men's rights might be horribly unpopular, and while a lot of the groups that advocate for men's rights have unfortunately allied with the right wing, I think that's mostly as a form of necessity than anything else, and it is an issue that we need to grapple with. Most men, heterosexual men, most men want to be desired by women. They want to please women. They want to be and to do the things that make them attractive, that make them a good prospect as a mate. But it seems like women aren't necessarily being honest with themselves about what they want, and aren't necessarily being honest with the men in their lives about what they want. There seems to be a disconnect between what is said, oh, we want you to open up, show emotion, etc., etc., and what they actually want. And this is confusing and alienating and disillusioning to a lot of men. This is why men start to get frustrated at being the nice guy or being friend-zoned and so on, because they're doing everything that the women say they want, but there is no response to it, and that leads to resentment. I think if we understand that rather than just blaming the men, then I think maybe we can make some sort of progress there, but it requires honesty. And you can look at statistics from dating apps and so on to see this huge disconnect at work, the difference between what women say they want and what they actually want when they're applying it statistically to a dating pool, unfortunately. And there's also another interesting aspect to this. There's a couple of studies on this now, but the withdrawal of benevolent sexism is seen as negative sexism. If a man doesn't hold a door open for a woman, a withdrawal of benevolent sexism, because after all, women are perfectly capable of opening doors by themselves, that's seen as misogyny, even though it's a withdrawal of benevolent sexism. Again, this just characterizes the disconnect between what people say they want and what they do actually want. Toxic masculinity is a concept that runs through a lot of this and this criticism of men. But the traits that are defined as toxic masculinity are all things that are positive incarnations of masculinity unless they're taken to extremes. The idea of strength, of power, of capability to do things is seen as toxic masculinity. But strength can be good. Power can be good. It's how you wield it, whether you wield it honourably or not, consistently, fairly, with justice. Stoicism is seen as bad. That's in the modern colloquial sense, of course, rather than the philosophical sense. Men's lack of emotion, or apparent lack of emotion, their toughness, their willingness to put up with things, taken to extremes, that might manifest as not going to the doctor even when you're ill, or never showing emotion at all, ever, in any circumstance. But it has its value. The ability to set aside emotions and do what needs to be done, at least for a time, is a positive trait of masculinity. Stoicism has always been my great problem, because not being conventionally masculine in a lot of other ways, just being tough and emotionless was something that was open to me in a way to express my masculinity. But I took it to a toxic degree and extent because it was the only thing available to me. Competitiveness. This is not something I particularly manifest, but yeah, it can be taken to a horrible extreme, but in its more moderated form, competitiveness can drive you to success, to better yourself, to better conditions not only for yourself but for those around you. Dominance could also be expressed as leadership, and that's a valuable trait, apparently toxically masculine, but in a lesser extent it can be positive. Self-sufficiency, isolation, it's good to be able to rely on yourself to do things, but you shouldn't cut yourself off from everybody. And so it goes for all of these supposed traits of toxic masculinity. Even entitlement, which we tend to see negatively, can just be seen as knowing what your rights are, getting what you're worth out of the world, what you're owed out of the world. It only becomes toxic when you take it to an extreme. Even virility or sexual aggressiveness, taken to an extreme, obviously that's massively negative, but there's something to be said for sexual confidence. And that seems to be something that a lot of women want, at least if they're attracted to the person in the first place. A certain amount of sexual aggressiveness. Look, I'm not it, but I know that the solution isn't people like Tate and his hyper-masculine, hyper-capitalist grind set. It's not Peterson with his lukewarm pseudo-intellectual traditionalism. Evolve or die. It's not any of these other gurus. It's also not the feminizers. It's not the Good Men Project. It's not capitulation in the gender war. It's got to be something else. It's got to be the same kind of examination and redefinition that women went through, but applied to men. But society is unwilling to confront the prejudice against men, the ways in which men are failing. It's unwilling to solve men's issues. Suicide, mental health crisis, education crisis. Men are still being held to account for the sins of past generations. And men, because they tend to be more stoic, self-sufficient, and isolated, either don't complain, or when they do, they become social pariahs. Someone has to step up, and the paradigm in society has to shift at the same time. So the people who do step up with interesting solutions and examples can do so without being written off, without being marginalized, without becoming pariahs. We have to make that space, and that's not something men can do. That's something women have to do, to make the space for men to be able to self-examine. Saying, there's a magical time on the cusp of true adolescence where you're no longer quite a child and not yet an adult. A time where the confidence of the teenager and the wonder of the child combine in a surge of optimism, hope and imagination to make some of the most important moments of our lives. There's a rich vein of films that tap into this time. These are the films where the kids save the world, find something fantastical, or solve a problem that the adults can't, or wouldn't even believe existed. Some of these are fantastical, some are not. Some are a loving homage to the older versions of the same sorts of stories. If you like The Goonies, Super 8, The Monster Squad, or Explorers, this is a game for you and your kids. Available at post-mort.com and drive-thru-RPG.
Ladies and gentlemen, a single bottle of Reverend Dr. Grimm's Miracle Elixir will solve your constipation, dissipation, exculpation, obstipation, extirpation, bastardization, demoralization, amortization, accusation, disorganization, boulderization, malversation, dehumanization, plagiarization, demonization, feminization, localization, categorization, stigmatization, monetization, pulverization, and rationalization, sterilization, victimization, infatuation, insinuation, vexation, masturbation, perturbation, litigation, subjugation, and the French pox, or your money back, as used by the crowned heads of Europe.